Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. Well, welcome back to the Prison Officer Podcast, everyone. Today's episode is something a little different that I haven't done before. I've interviewed a couple of people that have done books, but I haven't interviewed an artist, and I ran across this book called Behind the Razor Ribbon, A Correctional Officer's Perspective by Pat Bliss. And as I looked through this book of his artwork, it just really moved me and touched me with a lot of the stuff that I have experienced working in a penitentiary. And so I invited him to come on to the podcast, and he's here today to do an interview with us and talk about his art. How are you today, Pat?
I'm doing just great, thanks, Mike. And how about yourself?
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you here. I want to talk about how you got to some of this work and what you were feeling, because I know myself, I wrote a little book of poetry, and it was kind of a cathartic way for me to express some of the things that I saw while I was working in a penitentiary. And is that what kind of brought this book about? Was this a way for you to do that?
Absolutely. Well, being an artist, part-time artist back then, now I'm a full-time artist, and upon retirement, I realized that the story of correctional officers has been really badly portrayed through Hollywood and the press. And quite frankly, I saw an article in a magazine about prison art, but it was all about inmate art, which I've always supported fully. But I thought, I tell my stories through my art. And when I retired, I started doing one or two paintings about correctional officer life a year. And at first it was, I kept thinking, well, why am I wanting to revisit this? Why am I going back here? And at that time, I had a large commitment for another art group that I belonged to, where, I had to have X amount of paintings done. And of course, prison art isn't something that they would have been focusing on. So this was something I did kind of in my spare time, my spare time. And at first it was a little bit, I don't know if I want to revisit those things. And then actually about halfway through the process, I did a painting called Day One. It's actually one of the first paintings shown in the book. I think it's on the second one or something like that. But I portrayed myself walking into Saskatchewan Penitentiary, where I spent my career as a rookie back in the early 1980s in the old uniform, stiff and scared, going into the big brick monster. And so I painted it in a surrealist fashion where, the walls have ears, as we've always heard, and eyes are everywhere. And it, if you're not careful, the big brick monster will swallow you up, which is true. But I had so much fun with that, and it was so liberating that actually the rest of the paintings, I really, I found it was, I was able to deal with a lot of issues that I had buried for a long time. And it just flowed. And it's not just paintings, there's also three-dimensional sculptures in there as well. So it just kind of morphed into where it was going. And it was actually originally designed as a gallery show. But I had friends kept saying, hey, why don't you make a book of this? This would be awesome. I'd love to have this collection, because it meant a lot to my colleagues. And I thought, well, what a great way to get it out to the public, to show what we do, without the blood and gore as much as people want to see. and what daily life in prison is like when you're a correctional officer or a
Right.
staff member.
So that one there that you're talking about with the rookie and the veteran, that was one of them that I moved me a lot because I had a lot of the same feelings. And when I look at that, I see that rookie walking in and the eyes are looking out, and they're looking at him, and it's that nervousness, that unknown, and you don't know what you're walking into. But then when I look at the way you portrayed the veteran walking out, the eyes are still looking at him. The eyes are still there, but he don't care. He walked through there. He did it, and he did it successfully. So I know we've talked in the past. You grew up not too far from the Saskatchewan Penitentiary. Tell me about your perceptions of that before you ever walked in there. What did you do when you grew up, and how did you grow up, and then how did that prison come into your life?
Well, I grew up on a mixed farm. We raised cattle and crops and all sorts of different livestock. Horses were always a big part of my life. Uh, so I always wanted to be a farmer, literally being a cowboy. And the late 1970s and early 1980s were brutal. Interest rates were like unbelievable, up around 25%. Didn't take very many crop losses to realize that I'm done. 10 years of farming and we were finished. We were living on nothing. So we sold out, and I was looking for work. And originally I was looking to work on the farm annex of the prison farm with the beef cattle operation, because that was my background. That's what I had taken in university, and but there was no openings at the time. And so an old friend and neighbor said, "Hey, why don't you become a guard? And then, you can lateral into that job eventually when it comes open." I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. But up to that point, I'd always said there's no way in hell I'm going to work in a place like that. Even though another buddy of mine had said, "Hey, they're hiring." This is back probably about 7 years before it started. And I said, "Are you kidding? I am farming. That's all there is to it." And lo and behold, guess where I ended up? You got bills to pay, and it was a good paying job with good benefits. I thought, well, I'll give it a year and see what happens. And 27 years later, I made it through and made it to retirement, and now enjoying retirement. So,
Yeah, I think a lot of us get into prison work not so much because we wanted to, but because at the time I had gotten married and had a couple of kids, and, I had some jobs here and there, but I didn't have that job that had insurance and had stability. And, one thing about 29 years of prison work, I had a paycheck show up almost every time it was supposed to. The Bureau did have a couple of times where the federal budget was, not passed, so we went a couple of weeks, but there was always the paychecks were always there, the insurance was there. So I think there's a lot of us that get into it that way. Absolutely. So tell me about Saskatchewan Penitentiary. How big is it? How long has it been around? That type of stuff.
well, Saskatchewan Penitentiary was built in 1911, and it's the housing, as far as inmate population goes, fluctuates. When I first started in the main institution, we were maximum security, and we had approximately 700 inmates. And a lot of double bunking at that time. And depending on what the government is feeling, sometimes they'll say, "Oh, no more double bunking," so your population drops, and then all of a sudden there's a influx of inmates, and all of a sudden it's okay again, and so the population goes up. But it was originally, when I started, the main institution was maximum security. Plus, we had another institution built within the walls that was the special handling unit, which was the Supermax. which I did 2 tours in as well. And then attached also to the institution was the minimum security farm annex, which I ended up working at eventually too, about halfway through my career, which was a real. I always said I had the best job in corrections at that time, but now the main institution is a medium, and the old Supermax has become actually just a maximum security, which is, a lot of times, how it is, inmates ratings can be just a stroke of a pen depending on what the housing needs are. So things, it fluctuates a lot.
Right. I think probably one of the reasons that your art resonates with me so much is that it is an old penitentiary. And I started off at an old penitentiary. I started off at Missouri State Pen, which was built in 1837. And so I see a lot of similarities in, just the little nuances of your art and how you display that. And I think is one of the reasons it resonated with me. Another thing that we have in common is you're talking about the prison farms. And when I started at Missouri State Pen, those inmates made the soap for all of the prisons. I think Algoa Prison made the beef. They raised beef. Church Farm had a dairy. Ren's Farm that was the female joint, and they raised vegetables out there. And all of those were there to support the prisons. And that went on for quite a while, and I don't know the specifics of it. I always heard that there was some lawsuits filed because people couldn't compete with the inmate labor, and so now those have pretty much went away. So we don't even have prison farms anymore.
Sounds very familiar. That's exactly what's happened up here. I would think it would have been about, I think around 2006, 2008, somewhere in there. Somebody in Ottawa decided, nobody's going to need a job on a farm, so we'll get rid of the prison farms. We'll still maintain a minimum, but, we'll give them nothing to do. There is some housing projects that they do build ready to move housing, which is awesome. And they do have a welding program and groundskeeping, but that's it. There used to be 3 institutions within the Prairie region, which is Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, that provided all the food for the prisons. And, at one time, our farm at the institution I worked at had a huge vegetable crop, which I grew up watching all the time. Every time I went to town, I was just so impressed with this massive, massive garden. And, and all the inmates out working in it, and, a 2,000 head beef project, and as well as a heritage dairy herd that was known all over North America for being, some of the best bred dairy cattle and highest producing as far as milk. And we supplied milk products all over the place. We had chicken houses, laying eggs where they are shipped all over the western region here. Abattoirs, you name it. It was just an incredible situation. And I saw a lot of inmates that had never worked on a farm or ever even worked actually enjoy their job and just loved it out there. And just, they learned so much and actually progressed. When you go from working maximum and medium and supermax and seeing that revolving door going on all the time, and just to watch hardened criminals actually, change their life through work and compassion with working with animals. It was a bit of a heartbreaker for me here when they shut it down. And a lot of us, we were really, miffed by it. Like, why would they do that? It just didn't make sense. It was a program that really worked.
Yes. Yeah. And those inmates, and you grew up on a farm, so you know this, but I grew up on a farm. Those inmates were learning things that we learned when we were young, stuff like hard work. You can actually see what you accomplished. The fact that It doesn't matter if you don't feel like going out today. Those chickens and those cows or whatever you've got on your farm, they still have to be fed. You have to care for something. You have to take care of it no matter what. And those are life lessons that you can take right into any occupation. Yeah, I agree with you that those are, I hate seeing that we don't do more of that anymore.
I'd sure like to see it come back, but boy, they literally gutted all the buildings and sold off all the machinery for next to nothing. The cattle herds, that was sad to see though, because there was many decades of selective breeding to get them where they were, and they were respected in the dairy world for all over the place, and that's all gone and crazy.
So let's move on to another piece of artwork, or a couple of pieces that you've done here. And I've never seen it displayed before. And that is, I've seen Folger Adams keys, and people make tie clips and keychains and stuff like that out of similar type things. But to see it displayed as itself, and the impact that has on a correctional officer, because from the moment we walk into a prison, you're getting handed a Folger Adams key, and that's the most important thing that you carry with you all day. It gets you to and from, it gets you wherever. What was what was it that made you put that in here? Because you've got two little pieces of art with simple. It's just a Folger Adams key, but it's so much more than that.
Well, the actual painting of the Folger Adams key is it's huge. Well, not huge, but it's 24 by 36. But in terms of a Folger Adams key, it's multiple times bigger than it is. But the reason why I did that and expanded it was because I wanted to show the importance of that key and those keys, and then to expand upon that, I did a sculpture. All those keys that you see in that sculpture hanging from that belt clip, I actually made all those. They're all made out of, I made a mold out of one that I had been presented when I had left by a friend. It was a decommissioned key, so I just expanded upon that, and I made a mold, and those are all made out of epoxy resin. And the key clip, the key safe on my old belt, that was one of my service belts, and that was one of my key clips that I used for many, many years, so it's well worn. So those things have been to prison, but actually somebody commented on the other day, where did you get all those keys? And I said, well, I made them. They thought they were real, which, that was, I felt really good about that. But they're light as a feather compared to that many keys on your belt. You know what it's like, where they pull you down.
Oh, I do. Yeah. And I find it interesting. OK's key safes, that's what I've used for years down here too. And, you're using it up there in Canada. I'm using it down here in the U.S. You ever wonder how many times you clipped and unclipped those keys?
Oh, exactly. My wife said, it's such a familiar sound. Everybody does it differently. And she could hear me do it and, snap keys onto that thing, and it sounded different than anybody else. I never thought of that. But some of the old veterans, when I started, they had different methods. Some of them had fashioned a spoon into being their key clip that would fit onto their belt. And I thought, well, that was kind of interesting. And of course, sometimes you just shove them into your belt like, you would a gun or something, and you have it there, but they're always handy and they're in front of you, not stuck in your back pocket where somebody could pickpocket you. And another thing I pointed out in the book was the fact that, at least in my neck of the woods, the keys are never labeled. They're just, they have a serial number on them, and you just got to know where that number goes. And, but the funny thing is, the inmates will tell you, oh, you need 1107 for that one. And it's just like, how did you know that? Well, I watch you guys do it every day. Of course I know what key goes where. But still, if you dropped a set of keys, and you got to know exactly where those keys go, because you know what it's like. If there's an emergency, you better be ready to use that key either to lock that barrier up or let somebody out real quick. They're a highly important tool. In fact, I called them tools in my book because that's what we used to refer to them as, our tools. A lot of decisions made with having those in your hand.
So I'm going to skip a little farther ahead. I'm going to come back to some of these. So one of them that probably, resonated the most with me was the view from the tower. And, I started at Missouri State Pen. When I went to the federal system, I worked at Leavenworth, and both of those places had towers. There's a lot of correctional staff that have never worked a tower because they're kind of going away. But I have very vivid memories of working a tower. And you capture it in that photo. What all's going on, the inmates that are looking through the fence, the ones that are walking, and they're staying together either for protection or because they're talking about something. One of the inmates is hollering up at the tower. The coffee rings, the towers that I worked in, every piece of wood had been etched with somebody's name, the year they were there, and some of them was, 50, 60, 80 years old, some of those. That one really resonates with me. If you don't mind, I wrote a poem, and I'm going to read it from Monotonous Chaos, because I think your picture and this poem kind of go together in my mind. So this is Monotonous Chaos. Perched 30 foot above the prison yard in a stone tower built before the turn of the century, I watch over the repetitive lives of the men below me. A shotgun leans heavily against my leg, and the click, click, click of an ancient steel fan hypnotizes me as it blows hot summer air across my face. The tension in the air drips like molasses today. I notice that the yard is quiet, too quiet. I scan intently for what has interrupted the normal deafening roar of male voices, and a glint of steel in the sunlight catches my eye. No noise, just clustered motion. I try to notice who had the knife. He is lost in a sea of stone-chiseled faces that have all done the same thing. Like gawkers at a car wreck, the inmates gather round one inmate who is left lying in a pool of crimson blood turning sticky in the July heat. I see in many of the faces a desire to help, but every inmate knows that to do so would show weakness and target them next. Arriving all at once, the yard comes alive with officers pouring out of the shadows and doors like programmed robots, unaware of the danger. I chamber a round into the barrel of my shotgun. The distinctively sharp sound echoes across the yard, and the crowd of inmates steps back to give the officers room. Putting the injured one on the stretcher, the officers carry him off the yard like an injured football player. Splatters of dark blood are left to form an uneven pool that will stay until the next rainstorm washes the concrete clean. This one will not die. His blood will fertilize the growing hate that smothers this place. He will be patched up and take his revenge another day. The noise returns cautiously. The tension in the air fades. I adjust my duty belt and return to the long periods of monotony that are punctuated by these moments of complete chaos. And so when I saw that art of yours, that poem just came back to me. They just seem like they go together.
Mike, they certainly do. I could picture the whole thing. I've felt that so many times, and you nailed it with your poem. Nailed it.
Towers weren't the place I worked a lot, but I also have a vivid memory at Leavenworth, because Leavenworth sits on a pretty flat prairie up there, and those are some tall towers. And I remember the beauty of watching the thunderstorms roll in across the prairie, and you could see the lightning above and below the clouds from up there. And for people to think that you could find beauty like that while working in a prison, that doesn't seem like it makes sense. But there's lots of times like that I found beauty while I was at work.
Exactly. I used to love watching the sunrise or the sunset. Sunrise was great because there was actually nobody moving anywhere. Everybody was still locked up, so you could actually enjoy it. And like you said, the weather. There's one of the paintings. It's filtered through nature in the book. It's a bit of an abstract. I've got a beat up piece of chain link fencing, and there's green, and then there's dark, and it's hard to describe without seeing it. But what it is referring to is how we as officers, there's darkness that can't help but rub off on you inside the walls, but we're also bringing in the good as well, and things filter out, and hopefully for the better. And that's why I made that painting. And
Absolutely.
you described it very, very well.
Yeah. So tell me about another painting that I think is very dramatic and that a lot of officers can relate to, is the officer doing the checks down the dark hallway. I mean, that I've been in that housing unit, even though I really haven't. So tell me about your inspiration behind that one.
Well, it's something that doesn't leave you when you do. When you're working an awful lot of night shifts and you walk down those long dark ranges, and the smells, and trying to make sure that you've got a living, breathing body in every cell, and you have to do it. You can't dilly-dally, and you can't go and shine light in somebody's eyes unless they've been covering themselves up or whatever to see if they're alive. And you're armed with a flashlight and a pair of safety scissors. And you have, at least at Saskpen, when you're doing the range walks at night, you're looking after at least 8 different ranges like that on 4 different tiers. And sometimes you never know. Sometimes you get to run into booby traps on the range. So usually you don't, but every now and then it'll happen. And it's just walking down those ranges. And actually, a few of my colleagues have commented on that painting. That was one of their favorite ones, because as soon as they looked at it, they also said, "My God, I can smell it. I can smell the human, crowding." And well, shift work, I always liked shift work. I did. But I didn't realize the toll it was having on me physically. I'm glad to be out of it, but I used to like the shift work because, after hours it was, we were running the joint, and things were different. And it also afforded us time, during the daytime to do different things. Being so heavily involved with horses all during the time I worked at the pen, if we were on 8-hour shifts, I had 16 hours to do things. Whether I was training horses or actually going out on competitions, it actually afforded me to be able to do a lot of the things that I enjoyed. And during the time of the, you weren't off on very many weekends, so you got to enjoy going to places that weren't as crowded as usual. So there was a lot of things. However, I think out of the 27 years I worked in prison, I probably worked at least 20 Christmases, and that many, close to that many New Year's. I would usually, because I didn't have kids, a lot of times I would trade with the officers that had kids that they wanted to be home at Christmas. So, it was holidays like that you missed out on. And usually the trade-off was that I would have to come up with something different and move Christmas around, kind of thing, for my own family.
Yep. I think I had a little bit different perspective on the holidays because my father was a firefighter. So I had grown up that, every other holiday or every third holiday, we might have it at the fire station, or we might have it on the day before or the day after. So I think my kids were kind of used to the fact that we never did anything on the actual holiday.
That sounds familiar. my father being a farmer, well, he was at home all the time, which was great. But once I started working shift work, well, it kind of, then everybody was going, well, gee whiz, it's sure like to celebrate Christmas. Can't you take it off? Well, nope, sorry, can't, Dad.
So let me move on to another piece of your artwork, and this is probably one of the more powerful ones that's in there. And it is the note laying on the concrete with the blood around it and the footprint, the bloody footprint, where I'm presuming an officer has stepped in the blood, which we often do. So tell me about how you got there.
Well, as you know, there's a lot of images in that you'll never get out of your head. And we've all seen a lot of blood in those places at various times. And violence happens, whether it be self-inflicted or by other people. And in this particular case, what inspired this painting was, I remember an inmate that had gotten a Dear John letter, very much like that. I remember reading it, blood-soaked, because he'd survived, but he'd lost a lot of blood. And it was basically, of course, the names were changed when I wrote this out, and it was very, crudely written, but you could tell his spouse was really angry. And it was all about, putting pressure on her. He was probably put pressure on to pack drugs into the institution. And it talks about her, saying, I've had it. And this fellow had slashed up, and I was extremely conservative in the blood in my painting, because I remember that day, it was basically over, they had shoes, and when you get into a 9x5 cell, it'll contain the blood pretty, it doesn't flow very far. And it's not something I've ever forgotten. Sure. And but I wanted to show the reason why the officer's boot, which was my boot, by the way, it goes to the problem, not running away from it, because we always, where everybody has to, will vacate the area when something happens, we were the ones that actually had to run to it. And fortunately, this fellow survived, and I do believe he's still okay. But it was an eye-opener. It was one that had happened early in my career, and of course there were several since then, but that one always stuck with me.
Yeah. It kind of says to me also that even when whatever it is happens, the violence or the suicides or whatever it is, we always get some of that on us. It always becomes part of us, and that's kind of what I see from that footprint. So I know I grew up on a farm, and so I had butchered animals. That wasn't unusual, but I was surprised by the amount of blood in a human body. I don't think I was ready for that the first time.
Same here. It's an eye opener, and then you realize, okay, it's one thing when it's an animal, and an animal that you're basically sacrificing to feed yourself and your family. I mean, that's life. But when it's another human being, it affects you differently. Whether you like that human being or not, it is a human being, and it gets to you the first time, and that was one of my first. And of course, there was several times after that, but that was the one that affected me.
So another one of the paintings is the one with all the monitors, and it's probably looking from a control center or something. And I think it shows how so many different things go on in a prison at once. I mean, you've got an inmate cleaning the chow hall. You've got an inmate probably in a lockup or a mental health flipping off the camera. You've got, normal prison stuff going on. You've got a raven looking right into the camera, which I noticed that your ravens tend to be a common theme throughout the book. So tell me a little about that.
Well, it was inspired. I was always, I guess, impressed whenever I worked in the area that monitored all the alarms and video. You know, you're one officer and you're basically covering multiple areas in the institution, multiple purpose areas, and you have to be on your toes to see what the heck's going on all the time and be able to alert people in the area of what's going on. And it's a highly important thing. But I called it Big Brother because Big Brother really is watching everywhere in those institutions and actually the world right now. There's a lot of responsibility put on that officer, and you don't just put a rookie into a situation like that because they won't know what's going on. You've had to work in all those areas. And the reason why I did the Raven, they always added a lot of comic relief at our institution. We live in an area where there's a lot of the northern ravens, and they're a really big, incredibly intelligent bird. And actually, they've been the subject of many paintings besides these. They just impress me. But I always remember looking at a raven in the camera, and they see the reflection in the camera. And of course, they're looking at it, and it's kind of always made me smile whenever I saw them there. It was like, hello, our old friend, And they don't know they're in a prison. They just know that they're in another place where they can mooch off some food somewhere, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I've had conversations, I think, with spiders that are building webs in the corner of a camera, because you watch them all shift and you're like, oh, yeah, hey, Mr. Spider. So I know another big part of your career is represented with the dog handler. You were a dog handler for a while, correct?
That's correct. When we were maximum security, we had actually dogs that were multi-handler dogs, and there was just X amount of officers trained as dog handlers on each shift, and I just loved that post. I enjoyed the dogs. They were, they become your companion, even though you're using a different dog every shift. Sometimes you get to know them all, and they know your personality as well, and my God, those dogs are trained to protect you to death. And I just so respected that. And they were there for our protection. Wow. and to protect the public and other inmates. When it comes right down to it, that's what they're there for. But I remember the first time I seen a dog used to clear a yard of inmates that were refusing to come in. It was like, wow, that worked really good. But of course, animals were a huge part of my life all the time. So it was just another form of animal that I really enjoyed working with.
That's one of the other things that I think we have in common is I was a dog handler for about 6 years. I ran bloodhounds, and we went after escapees and stuff. But it was a great part of my career that I got to do stuff that you don't normally get to do in prison, which is go out and meet the public. And we got to go out and help find lost children and walkaways from nursing homes. So it was a way to do things that the public noticed, because normally the public doesn't notice us.
I really wish that we would have had a program like that, because that just sounds incredible. Actually, when they were introducing the drug detection dogs, I had really contemplated becoming a handler and being paired up with a dog. But I realized that it would take an awful lot of commitment. And at that time, I was very heavily involved with horses. They took up all of my wife's and my spare time. And I knew that I'd have to either commit to one or the other, and I picked horses over them. But boy, to be able to go out and search like that, I think that is just, that is the greatest.
Yeah, one of the last paintings in your book actually depicts you standing there with your horses, and I'm guessing this is after work. And I will tell you something funny, that I noticed that your tie clip is undone, and we also had clip-on ties. And my entire career, I think my supervisors were always on to me for not having that tie clip clipped. And but tell me about your horses, and I that's your relaxation, it looks like.
Well, horses were a big part of my life right from the time I could walk, really. And but the horses that I depicted in that painting were the buckskin was the horse that I had when I started my career at the pen, and the bay horse was the horse I had when I finished. And of course, there was many horses throughout my life, but a lot of times as a shift worker, and we were talking about working shifts, I'd come home and after a stressful day, and there was nobody there to, talk to. And so my horses, my dogs and cats, they've heard everything. And that's something that actually followed me all through life, even before corrections. If I wanted to talk to somebody and didn't want it to get blabbed around, I would always tell my horse, they'd hear it all, including my bad singing. But the horses were always there. I'd get home from a shift and you'd be stressed right out, nobody there to express yourself with. And boy, they were really good listeners, and they could pick up on your mood, so it was quite a deal. I'm glad I had them there.
You're quite an artist, because many times throughout your artwork here, and this is one of those pictures, I recognize how bad a day you've had and how much you needed to get it off of you while you're standing there next to that horse. You can see it in the face. And I had those days myself where you just come home and you just needed that break. You needed to breathe. Sometimes you'd work 16 hours and you didn't know what day it was when you walked out. But yeah, I think you captured that. So.
Oh, great. I'm glad to hear that. Going back to expressing myself, having an animal to talk to, that was usually on shifts where, my wife's and my paths didn't cross. My wife also worked at the penitentiary and as a correctional officer, and then in very many other fields within corrections. So she understood everything. And so, which can be good or bad. So we decided that right off the bat, we'd sit down, have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or whatever, get it off our chests, either one of us. Whether it take half an hour or 2 hours, we debrief. And right. That was a huge lifesaver. I'm so glad that she was there to understand what was going on. And, if I describe a certain area, this happened, she'd know exactly what was going on, and vice versa. She actually, when she was a correctional officer, she worked in just about entirely in the Supermax. She was a big part in this whole process of this book too. She made my words make sense.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, I can't thank you enough to come on here and to talk about this. I am just fascinated by your art. I'm so glad I found this book. It's been good for me to read through it, and good for me to see that, every time that correctional staff get to see that they're not alone, that there's other people who deal with the same stuff they do. I think that is just a huge plus in our own mental health. So I recommend anybody who's worked in corrections go out and buy this book. It's called Behind the Razor Ribbon. If you'd tell us a little bit about where they can get the book and, how they can contact you if they want to, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. It's available through Amazon. If you look up, you can either do a search for Pat Bliss, or you can also search Behind the Razor Ribbon, a correctional officer's perspective, and it should come up. You can order that way, or you can order through my publisher, which is the Friesen Press online bookstore. They can also send it. That's the basic way to get a hold of it. Otherwise, we just sell it locally right now. So,
And then you have a website, correct?
I do. I have to apologize. It does need some updating, and I'm working on that. But my website is Grafton North Art, and that's Grafton North Art. Grafton was the name of our farm, so that's where that comes from. But it also displays a little bit of the artwork that's in this book and talks a little bit about that, as well as a lot of my usual paintings, which are very Western based, very lots of horses, lots of landscapes, lots of ravens. There's all kinds of different things in there, so you can get a bit of more of an idea of where I'm coming from on that. But I didn't want to give away too much on the book.
Well, thank you so much, Pat, for joining us today. I recommend that everybody go out and get this book, take a look at it. It's if you've worked in prison any time at all, it's going to touch you, and you're gonna recognize some of what Pat put in his art here. So, thank you, Pat, and I hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, Mike, and I really, really appreciate it, and I really enjoy your podcast too.
Thank you, Pat. You have a great day.
You too, Mike. You take care.
If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Till next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.